Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about creating patterns, and I will also show a little bit about manipulating and editing patterns. Creating a pattern in Illustrator is relatively easy, though it can get complex depending on the pattern you're trying to create. I'm going to show you the basics, and then you can take it further by exploring on your own. At minimum, you need one object to create a pattern. It could be a simple geometric shape or whatever you want it to be. In this case, I'm going to use this fish to show you how easy it is to create a pattern. All you need to do is select the object, and under the object menu you go to the pattern submenu, and so it's object pattern make. And what this will bring up a pattern option box here, which allows you to define your pattern in many different ways. You can give it a name. Right now I'll call it let's call it bluefish because it's important to use logical names. And then there's different types of patterns we can have. By default, it's just a grid, and what happens is the pattern is a repeating grid of rectangles, and by default the rectangle is going to be based on the bounding box or the outer edges of whatever you had selected. So we can go with that, and let's just do that first and see where we're at. If I select this and say done, I've just created a pattern. And so if I create a rectangular shape, oh, it's getting away from me here. Let's create any shape. Select my fill box and click here, and it's now filled with the pattern. But let's look at ways we can modify this or get something slightly different. So I'm going to select this again, object menu, pattern, make. It comes up with the same thing. Now I'm going to look at some of our other options. So we can offset each row with this option brick by row, and within that our standard offset is going to be a halfway offset, but you can offset it by other percentages or ratios if you want, to get whatever you want. Let's say 2/5 is what we want right now, and you can see that it starts to get an offset. All right, I can also choose to offset by columns. Same sort of thing, all the standard settings, depending on what we're trying to accomplish. And then finally, there are hexagonal offsets, which are going to typically pull things a little bit closer. It's not going to be ideal for this fish. I will show you another design where I use hexagonal offsets with a different type of shape. So I'm going to go back to brick by row for right now, and I'm going to choose my offset. I kind of like that 2/5. I'm going to save this pattern as well, and all I need to do, let's give it a name, and save just by clicking on the done button. And so I've got a second pattern now. Again, I should have just, well, I'm not going to keep this box in here, but you can see there's one pattern and the second pattern. All right, so you can create as many patterns as you want actually from the same basic object. I'm going to select it again, object, pattern, make, and we'll get some other features in here. So I can, if I want to, I can give actual dimensions of my tile, which is the repeating rectangle. So I set it at 3 inches. Let's say set it by 3 by 2 inches, and you can see that's going to change the spacing between the objects that are in there. I can also still do that by using my different brick settings. Other options here, size tile to art. That goes back to where we were in the first place, where our tile is going to match the size of our bounding box of our objects. Move tile with art. That means if I move the art around on the board, the tile will move with it. I like to leave that turned off because I can actually move objects around independent of the edge of the tile. If you want to, you can also deal with spacing, and here's some overlap. So let's look at how some of these things happen. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually have another fish on my clipboard. I'm going to paste it in, and he's going to come in. And so one thing to pay attention here is I can interactively add or delete or change objects within my pattern as I'm working. So I'm going to move this fish around and offset it a little bit. And now my tile, because it's size tile to art, is going to be based on the bounding box of these two fish together. So if you see, if I move them around, my pattern is going to change and update to that. All right, so I can play with this and, you know, create the repeat based on the relationship between these two fish or two objects, whatever you may be creating with. And so what I'm going to do is work with this right now, and I'm going to turn off size tile to art, where I can do it, change my tile size by numbers, doing it numerically, or there's a tool here, the pattern tile tool, which is going to show me my tile size. And just like I could with the bounding box for other objects, I can change the ratio or the size of my tile, and doing this interactively till I get my objects as dense or as loose as I want. If I make it bigger, they're going to be much looser. If I pull it in, it's going to be much tighter and much more dense. So I can create whatever overlap I want. And so we can see this overlap here. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to come down. We're going to look at this overlap in a moment. But before I do that, I'm going to show you here. We can set how many repeats we have in our preview. By default, it's 5 by 5. It's pretty good standard, but depending on the size of the objects in your pattern, you may want more or less, just so you can see what the repeat is. Also, I have this option to dim the copies, so you can see that my main pattern tile is fully saturated. The repeats, the preview, is dimmed back a little bit, and if I turn that off, you can see now the pattern in its full glory. Depending on what you're trying to do, you may want different settings. Now, as we look at this, our tiles start to overlap a little bit. So that, and what I mean by that is there's not a complete space between or surrounding each of these objects. They're so tight that they're starting to overlap, and that's fine. But you may not always get what you want. For example, if I want the goldfish to be in front of the blue fish, I need to see if I can change that through my overlap. So once the objects within the pattern start to overlap, these buttons come in handy. So by default, every tile that's to the left is above the one to the right of it. And I can change that. All right, so the left is in front, right is in front. Not much happening there in this situation. However, I can also change the top and the bottom in front. So now you can see I can pull by clicking on the bottom in front. The goldfish comes in front. If I click here, it goes in back. So sometimes you might have to play with these to get different relationships. So if I move him a little bit more this way, then we might see a little bit of interplay with these two. Maybe not. Let me get my tile. I'll tighten this a little bit so we can get it in, and then we should see a change in relationship as we do this. So you can see a small change in relationship here, where this tail comes in front. If you look, the tail goes in back. But you can play with that until you get the right relationship that you want. Ultimately, if we make our tile size smaller than the objects within it, we have to deal with an overlap. I'll call this 2 fish and save it. So now we have created quickly 3 different pattern tiles that we could access anytime we want to within this file. If I want to edit an existing pattern, I can do so by going to the swatches panel and double clicking on it it will bring it up, and I can then edit it by making any changes I want. In this case, maybe I'll change my density a little bit by opening this up, and then going in and repositioning the goldfish to see what we got here. Let's do something a little bit like this. And let's tighten it up just a little bit. And there we go. So I use my pattern tile tool to change the or ratio of my pattern tile, and I use my selection tool to change the position of objects within there, so I get something that I'm happy with. If I'm happy with that, I can click on Done, and it is updated, and it will be applied across all the tiles that I want, or I should say all the tiles that are currently using it. All right, let's delete this and look at some other ways of making patterns. So quickly, I'm going to go, I have a really simple object here. And something to keep in mind with these is that a pattern tile, to work well, if something's gonna touch an edge, it actually has to match the other edge in most cases. So in drawing this little shape here, I want to make sure that this left anchor point matches the right anchor point. So when the tiles are put together, they align perfectly, and I don't get any weird little jumps inside of my pattern. So I'm going to get rid of that guide just so you understand. So when it's important when making a pattern, again, to make sure that your objects on the sides are corresponding. The more complex a pattern is, the more difficult it can be, but I will show you in a little bit later how to take care of that. But what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to select this pattern, go back to my pattern tile make. Right now, the repeat is simply based on my bounding box, which we've seen before with the fish. But what I want you to notice before I go any further is that these objects are seamlessly going into each other, and that is because, as I mentioned before, the anchor points are aligned. If I was to have anchor points that didn't align, if I was a little sloppy, you're going to see that the pattern tiles are not going to align so smoothly, not at all. I get this little jump in there, and it's not going to be effective how I want it to be. So what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to go to my pattern tile tool, and I'm going to really reduce the size of my bounding box so that I get an overlap. All right, and we saw this as with the previous pattern of the fish. It's not really doing much right now, and that is because of my overlap is set where the top object overlaps the bottom object. So what I'm going to do is change that. So now I can get this water type pattern, and if I want to change it, offset a little bit, then I can go brick by row, and find a setting that works. Let's do this. Something like this will be fine. And depending on how dense I want these waves to be, my pattern tile tool is what I'll use. So if I click here with my pattern tile tool, the shorter I make it, of course, the more they're going to overlap. And let's do something like this. So you can see my pattern tile is actually going to be quite small as far as where the tool is, and but though my final swatch is going to be with this dotted line. All right, so it's going to repeat within that area. I'll click on Done. Let's call this Wave. Always set good habits. Give patterns names. Otherwise, you'll see pattern tile 1, pattern tile 2, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. So let's give it a name that makes sense. Let's call it Done. Let's draw a box, and there we go. There is my wave pattern. And again, if I wanted to, I could duplicate that or edit that to get different variations within it. Now, something that I also set up here is within my waves is I used global color swatches within it. So if I want to change the colors within my pattern here, I can do that by simply double clicking on one of these swatches and changing the color. So if I wanted to lighten that color a bit, you can see it's there. Or maybe I want to completely change the color. Let's make it a green ocean, right? And if I click on OK, that will then be updated. And that is simply done by editing the definition of my global color that I'm using. And it'll apply it. This can be a real handy tool, so you don't actually have to go into the pattern and redefine the colors within the object. All right. Let's see. Let's look at using the other offset in there. I drew this pattern, and it was based on a diamond shape. And real quickly, just to show you what I did to create the diamond shape, I simply created a square, and I rotated that square 45 degrees. And then with my scale tool, I simply changed the width of it to whatever I wanted. And this works pretty well because a diamond shape this way is going to align. So if I drag it, you can see that all the edges align. So it makes an easy repeat. Excuse me. Then what I did, if you might notice here, that this diamond is a guide. So any path I can draw in Illustrator becomes a guide. So under my View menu, I go to Guides, and I say Make Guide. And that object is now made into a guide. And then I can use that as a reference for drawing. Let me undo that. I don't need that anymore. But let's zoom in here. So I drew this object within there with a little bit of extension outside of it, understanding that where this extends out, it's going to have to match up down here somewhere, and kind of understanding where those go. And so what I'm going to do now with this is I will do just like we've done before. Select this. I'm going to my Object menu, Object Pattern, Make. And what's going to happen here is that our grid is not going to work so well. Yeah, this may be what you want, but in this case, I want a little different offset. I could go brick by column, which is fine. It gives me a pretty good offset. By default, it's going to be a little loose, but I could also go hexagonal by column, and that's going to pull them in quickly, much closer to where I want them to be. If I go to my pattern tile tool, you'll see now the tile that it's using is based on a hexagonal pattern. It's not a perfectly symmetrical, if you will, hexagon, where all the sides are equal, because it is again looking at the edges of the object that I had originally selected, and because of that, it pulls it in closer. I have options here. I can I can make it smaller if I want to bring it tighter, just like we can with the rectangular bounding box. So if I want to make it really dense, I could do that, or I could also loosen it up a little bit and play with that. Change the shape until I get something that I like. So, all right, let's say this is working fine. I will call it Hex Skull, and we will save it. And so I have now made a pattern that is filled with the skull design. So at least in my experience, I find that with the hexagonal pattern, I either create a tile or my original design to fit within a diamond shape or a hexagon. A hexagon is a much more complex and don't do it much, but that the hexagonal design works well. Now I want to show a much more complex relationship of objects, and I'm going to click here to show you this pattern here that I created. I'm going to deconstruct it a little bit for you so you can see how this is made. So one thing that's very important to understand about a pattern like this, where I'm not simply just taking a single object and using the tools to offset it and everything, is that it's going to end up being based on a rectangle. So the first thing I do is I draw a rectangle, and I make it of a specific size depending on what I'm trying to do. So in this one, this is a square. It's 72 points by 72 points, and this information is going to be important. But what we need to understand is that to make this repeat work, if an object like this object right here, if it touches an edge, so it touches the right edge, it also has to touch the left edge at the same position. It has to align equally on both areas. Something that goes off the top edge, it has to overlap the bottom edge the same amount. If objects fall completely within the rectangle, then we don't have to do anything. We can just let them be, because their repeat is not edge critical, if you will. So what I'm going to do is I am going to delete these objects and show you my method for making sure these things align. And then what I'm going to do is take these internal objects right now, and I am going to hide them so they are out of the way. Whoops, I need to go back a little bit. I accidentally deleted one too many objects. I want to keep this object in here, so let's hide these. All right. So if you're going to create a very thick pattern before you do create the tile, what you need to do is do it in sort of steps. You need to make sure that you get your edges taken care of before you get the internal space taken care of. And what I'm going to do real quickly is I'm going to shift both of these slightly so that there's overlap and multiple places. So what I do is I analyze the position of my objects, and I look and I say, look, for example, this object, and I see that it overlaps the left edge, it overlaps the right edge and the top edge. That means I have to duplicate one for the left edge, one for the right edge, and for the bottom edge. So what I'm going to do is select it, and because I know my pattern is going to be 72 points by 72 points, I can easily move this the amount that I need. And so if I go to my selection tool and double click on it, I can bring up my move dialog box. So I'm going to move it horizontally 72 points. And I'm not going to move it vertically at all. I'm going to copy. So now I have a copy over here that overlaps this edge just a slight amount, because it overlaps off this edge just a slight amount. So, and I knew exactly how far to move it, 72 points, because that is the width of my tile. So I'm going to select it again, and I am going to bring up my dialog box. This time I'm going to make a duplicate that goes to the left, so I'm going to make it negative 72 points. So in my move dialog box, a negative value moves either to the left, or if I'm vertical, a negative value would move up. So I'm going to again click on the copy button, and so now I have this overlap here to match where these two objects will match up. Now finally I have this other object here which is overlapping the right edge and the bottom edge, so I need to move it to the left and I need to move it up. Now since I had just moved this one to the left 72 points, the transform command is that transformation is remembered within Illustrator, and I can actually press Command D, or I can say Object Transform and say Transform again, and that is going to move the exact same amount in the same direction that this previous object moved. So these are now perfectly aligned with the left edge. Alternatively, I could have selected both of these objects and moved them at once. But sometimes when I'm talking through the process, I don't do it the most efficient as possible. So then I need to move this up. I do not need to move this up because it's only exists for this small position here, but I do need to make sure that this part, this continuation, continues into the tile. So I'll select this, bring up my move dialog box. I do not need to move this time horizontally, so I'll zero that out and enter negative 72 and copy. Remember, negative will move up. So now I have all these objects positioned where they need to be. And so when my tile is repeated, it will align up correctly. Now I will add those other objects to show them, to make sure they're visible. Might need to make an adjustment here in case, because it looks like some things might have moved. But let's do a little adjustment here. Now, one thing, as I look at this, before I go ahead, I realize that I actually did not move this object down into this area. So I'm going to select it, bring up my move dialog box. I'm going to zero. I'm going to move it vertically, 72 points to match the height. Copy, and there we go. So now I should have all my objects in place. If I select everything, and then go to my, I'm going to zoom out just a little bit and go to my pattern make command. All right, you're going to see something interesting here, because remember, by default, our pattern grid is going to be based on the bounding box, or the area of my objects that are selected. Now, there's two ways to deal with this. I'm going to show you first the easy, well, the numeric way, and then I'll show you a way that I actually prefer more than anything, because it's based on the older way of doing it before we had this this command here, and it makes things easy as well. So what we do, we need to bring this in, and if I use my pattern tile tool, you know, I can select this and I can move things in. And then I would have to eyeball it and such, which I don't necessarily want to do. But what I can do is I know how wide my tile is going to be. It's going to be 72 points. So I'm going to type that in. I know how tall it's going to be. It's going to be 72 points. And this is why you don't just randomly establish a tile size. And so there we go. We have now we have a repeat pattern that's the right size. I noticed that as I shifted things around, I'm getting a little weirdness in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a couple of objects, and and I'm going to press my left arrow to nudge them to the right, just 1 point. Maybe I'll go another one and see. So to get them all back into position, you can see it's updated everywhere. So it's that great interactive relationship we have when creating tiles. And you know, Illustrator hasn't always been this way. This is a relatively new feature, only a couple years that they've had it this way. Tiles patterns used to be much more difficult to make. Let's just call this swirls. And I'll say done. And now we have that pattern tile. And if I select and I click, we have it here. All right. Not too bad. I'm going to move this up. Actually, what I'm going to do is delete it. I don't actually need it anymore, right? Because if I need to access that, I can double click here, and all that data is stored here within my tile definition. So I really don't necessarily need those original paths. I'm going to do this. I'm going to show you now a little bit about editing these pattern tiles as after we create them. Because when we create a pattern tile, we may not have it the size that we ultimately want to use it, or we may use it in multiple places and want to change the size or make other transformations to it. And we can do that, so we can scale it, we can rotate it, we can shear it, and reflect it. We can do any of these things by going to our transforming tools. So for example, if I want to rotate it, I can go to my rotate tool, And I'll show you if I rotate, by default, the object rotates and the pattern stays static. But if I double click on my rotate tool, I can say transform patterns. So right now I have it set up so both the object and the pattern will transform together. Very often we want to do that, but maybe you want to keep the rectangle horizontal and just rotate the pattern within it. If I want to do that, then I can turn off transform objects, and then the pattern can rotate within there, and I can set it to whatever I want. Same is true for the scale tool. If I double click, you can see that the transform patterns is on, transform objects is off. If I set these options in one of my transforming tools, it will be available in all of the transform tools. That will be the setting that will come up, and so just be aware of that. If your one thing is scaling like the object and not the pattern, or the pattern not the object, just come here and you can change that. Now what I'm going to do though, you can see we scaled. Let's click on OK. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in here and I am going to turn off the transforming patterns and say transform the object, and so that those settings are there. And so now if I scale something using my scale tool, the object transforms but not the pattern. However, I want to show you a keyboard shortcut that is really handy. If I want to use a tool, not the dialog box, but use the tool to make a scaling, and I want to do it, do just the pattern but not the object, what I can do is I can press the tilde key, the key just above the tab key, and if I, excuse me, and let me try this again. They've changed the keyboard shortcut with the newest version of Illustrator, so you don't want to press tilde and shift at the same time. It'll jump for you. Now, so I'm going to start to scale. You can see my object is scaling, but if I hold down the tilde key, it looks like the object is still scaling, but when I let go, it's actually the pattern that's scaling. So again, tilde, and whoops, excuse me. I have my rotate tool. So hold my tilde as I rotate, and you can see the pattern is rotating within it. If I could do the same thing with other tools, let's see. Let's go to my shear tool, and I'm going to hold down tilde. I'm going to shear, and you can see the pattern is being sheared. I am going to go to this other document real quick, and the reason I'm doing that, I'm going to show you that if I go to another document, it's only got the patterns that I created within that document. So if I want to take a pattern to another document, I can just create an object and fill it with the pattern, cut it or copy it, take it to the other document and paste it. As soon as I bring that object in, that pattern is in there. And what I want to show you is if I select this and I fill it with a different pattern, it's going to inherit all of those transformations that I made, the scaling, the shearing, and the moving, and all of that. So that may or may not be what you want, but let's say you want to fill with another pattern, but you want it to go in its default layout. What you want to do is just with your object, fill it with a solid color. If you fill it with the solid color, it's going to reset all those transformations, and then when you click, it'll go back to its default layout for the pattern. One last thing I want to address is what do you do if you create all these patterns and you want to access them, because the patterns are only stored within the document that they're created in, at least by default. You want to create a situation where you can add other patterns to a library, for example, and collect them together. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go through and I am going to go to my other documents where I created patterns, and I'm going to draw a couple of objects here. I'll fill one with that pattern, and then I will select the other one, fill it with the different pattern, and I have 3 patterns here. So what I'm going to do is choose this. So I've got all 3 patterns. I'm going to paste these into this document. So now those swatches come over, and notice if I'm using global colors, they're going to come over as well. So I can get global swatches and color swatches. I can delete these. I actually don't need any of this data in here now. What I'm going to do now is, let's see, we have our water pattern. I'll take this and I will paste it in to bring the swatch and the colors over. I'll delete it. So I have the skull pattern, which we've created, the multiple fish patterns, the water pattern, and then the swirly pattern. All of those are now stored within this document, even though I'm not using it currently within any objects. So what I can do now is I'll go to my swatch libraries menu, and I can save swatches. And it's going to go to this default folder, and I will call it demo swatches. Let's do that so I can remember what these were. Demo swatches, and I save. Now, if I create a new document, and it goes back to the default swatches, so none of those patterns are there. If I want to access any of those, what I can do is I can go to my swatches library. I can click, and down here under user defined, I see demo swatches. If I click, a little library is going to come up, a little floating library. These are not currently in my document, but I'm accessing them. As soon as I select any of these, they will move over into here. So if I assign the 2 fish, the 2 fish will come over. Or if I assign the skull, it will come over. So this is a way you can save swatches over time. You could reopen that file at a future date, add new swatches, and build a library of swatches that you can then access. Because I guarantee you, if you do end up creating a lot of patterns and they're in a whole bunch of different documents, it gets really hard to keep track of them and hard to access them, and can be very frustrating. So it's good to set up your own one file where you collect them all and update them whenever you create new patterns. So try making some patterns on your own. Have fun with it, but don't forget to save them so that you can access them later.